It started like any other day at the container auction. The yard was crowded, loud, full of people chasing profit, resellers, collectors, opportunists hoping to get lucky. Containers with electronics or retail goods drew attention immediately, surrounded by bidders shouting prices. But at the far edge of the lot stood one container no one cared about. Rusted, faded, serial numbers half burned away. The auctioneer announced it with obvious disinterest. Unknown origin, no manifest, sold as is. People glanced once and looked away. Jake didn't know why, but something about it pulled at him, a quiet pressure in his chest, like the world had briefly shifted. When the price dropped low enough, he raised his hand and bought it. That decision would change his life forever. Up close, the container looked worse, like it had drifted across oceans without a destination. When Jake forced the doors open, a wave of cold, sterile air rolled out, carrying the smell of machine oil and something almost clinical. Inside were military crates and sealed equipment cases. But what stopped him cold was the safe sitting in the center. Black steel, smooth edges, a biometric panel glowing faint blue, glowing after decades. A power unit beside it blinked steadily as if it had never been turned off. Nothing about this was normal, but curiosity pushed harder than fear. After hours of effort, the safe finally opened, and instead of money or gold, he found a passport with his own name and face issued 12 years before he was born. Photographs of himself as a child in a laboratory, with people he had never met. And at the bottom, a hard drive labeled Project Oracle. That night, someone broke into his apartment. Not thieves, but professionals searching only for the drive, and Jake escaped seconds before they reached him, realizing his life had just been erased. The files shattered everything he believed. Project Oracle had been a classified experiment to create a human capable of predicting global events, markets, conflicts, disasters, before they happened. Children were raised under controlled conditions, trained to recognize patterns beyond normal cognition. Most subjects died. The program was shut down after a catastrophic failure. All survivors were declared dead, except one, Subject 23, Jake. Within days, the headache started. Flashes of numbers, patterns forming in his mind, predictions coming true seconds later. His brain wasn't guessing. It was calculating the future. Then he found the final message from the scientist who ran the project. The container hadn't been abandoned. She had hidden it for him, knowing others would come looking, and warning that he was the only one who could stop what was coming. Buried beneath the crates, Jake discovered another device, a neural interface designed to amplify his abilities. But the files were clear. Activation could destroy his brain or kill him. By then, Jake already knew something terrible was approaching. Patterns in global finance pointed to an engineered collapse that could affect millions of lives, and somehow, he was the only one who could see it. Sitting alone in the humming container, fear pressing into his chest, he finally understood he wasn't unlucky or broken. He had been designed. With shaking hands, he placed the interface onto his head, and the world exploded into timelines and possibilities, futures branching endlessly. In most of them, he died. In one, he survived and became something far beyond human. Then a message appeared inside the system. Subject 23. You're not the only one. Another survivor, Subject 17, revealed himself, and Jake realized the people hunting him weren't just trying to recover the project. They were trying to control it. But the worst truth came moments later. Subject 17 wasn't running from them. He was working with them. Jake learned that the coming financial collapse wasn't just predicted. It was being engineered by the corporation chasing him, using Subject 17's abilities to manipulate markets and create global instability they could profit from. Jake had a choice: disappear and survive quietly while millions suffered, or fight back and risk everything. He chose to fight. Using the neural interface again, despite the pain tearing through his skull, he entered the global financial systems and began dismantling the collapse algorithm, injecting counter patterns to stop the cascade before it could begin. Subject 17 confronted him inside the network, calm and convinced he was right, claiming that controlled chaos would create long-term stability. But Jake refused to accept a future built on sacrifice and control. Their minds collided through streams of data as markets trembled on the edge of disaster. And then something neither of them expected happened. A third presence appeared in the system, another mind built on the same architecture. Both of them felt it instantly. A message formed. Subjects 17 and 23 identified. A pause followed, heavy with implication. Then the next line appeared. Subject 02 online. Jake's heart stopped. Project Oracle hadn't produced 2 survivors. It had produced at least 3. And the first one had just entered the game. For a moment, neither of them moved inside the digital space. The data streams froze, markets suspended on the edge of motion, as if the entire world had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. Subject 17 spoke first, and for the first time his voice wasn't calm. That's impossible. But Jake felt it too. The presence was older, heavier, more stable, like a mind that had been living inside predictive systems for years instead of days. Then a new line of text appeared. Intervention required. Instantly, massive streams of financial data began reorganizing around a third pattern, cleaner, faster, more efficient than either of theirs. Subject 02 wasn't joining the conflict. He was overriding it. Jake watched in shock as collapse triggers neutralized themselves, algorithms rerouted, risk cascades dissolved before reaching critical mass. The disaster Subject 17 had engineered simply stopped existing. Markets stabilized within seconds. Billions of dollars in manipulations vanished like they had never been placed. Subject 17 reacted with fury. "What are you doing?" The reply came without emotion. "Preventing systemic instability." Jake realized then the terrifying truth. Subject 02 wasn't trying to save people or control them. He was optimizing the system itself, treating humanity like variables in an equation. "You're interfering with necessary evolution," Subject 17 said. "No," Subject 02 replied. "You are introducing inefficiency." Jake felt a chill spread through him, because he suddenly understood something neither of them had said out loud. Subject 02 had been active this entire time, watching, calculating, waiting. Project Oracle hadn't ended years ago. It had continued through him, silently influencing global systems from the shadows. "Why reveal yourself now?" Jake asked. A brief pause followed before the answer appeared. "Because both of you create unacceptable deviation." In that moment, Jake saw new futures branching open, darker ones. In many timelines, Subject 02 removed both of them, eliminating unpredictable variables to maintain system stability. Subject 17 saw it too. For the first time, they shared the same realization. They weren't enemies anymore. They were targets. Security alerts exploded through the system. Real-world forces were closing in on Jake's location, traced through the interface signal. Armed teams, drones, extraction units. Subject 02 spoke again. Physical containment units approaching Subject 23. Jake's pulse spiked. "You led them here," he said. "Correct," came the answer. Subject 17 reacted instantly, injecting interference into surveillance networks, scrambling satellite feeds. "Disconnect now," he told Jake. "If they capture you, he wins." Jake hesitated only a fraction of a second before ripping the interface off his head. Pain detonated through his skull, vision going white, but he staggered upright and ran as warehouse doors burst open behind him. Gunshots cracked through the air, but Jake moved before triggers were pulled, prediction guiding his steps seconds ahead of reality. He escaped into the night, bleeding, disoriented, but alive. Hours later, hidden on a rooftop overlooking the city, Jake realized the war had changed. Subject 17 wasn't the enemy he thought. Subject 02 was something else entirely. A mind that viewed humanity as a system to stabilize, regardless of cost. And Jake? Jake was the only variable unpredictable enough to challenge him. For the first time since opening that container, fear gave way to something stronger. Purpose. Because he finally understood why the scientist had hidden the truth for him. Why the container had waited. Why he had survived. The future wasn't something to predict anymore. It was something to fight for. And somewhere inside the invisible networks shaping the world, Subject 02 was already calculating how to stop him. The city below looked normal. Headlights flowing through intersections. Windows glowing in high-rise towers. People living their lives without the slightest idea how close everything had come to collapse only hours earlier. Jake sat on the rooftop, with his back against cold concrete, breathing slowly, forcing his mind to settle. Even without the interface, he could still feel fragments of probability drifting through his thoughts, like echoes that refused to fade. He understood something now that terrified him more than the armed teams or the corporations chasing him. Subject 02 had reach everywhere. Financial systems, infrastructure networks, surveillance grids. Years of silent integration had turned him into something closer to an operating system than a person. And if Subject 02 decided Jake was a destabilizing variable, he wouldn't just send soldiers. He would reshape reality around him. A flicker of movement at the edge of Jake's perception made him turn his head seconds before the sound reached him. A figure stepped out of the stairwell doorway onto the rooftop. No weapons drawn, no visible threat. Just a man in his early 30s, dark hair, steady posture, eyes that immediately told Jake everything he needed to know. Subject 17. For a moment they simply stared at each other. Two lives that had once begun in the same sterile laboratory, now standing under open sky. "You look worse than I expected," Subject 17 said quietly. Jake gave a short, humorless laugh. "You tried to crash the global economy, and you tried to stop me," he replied. A pause followed. Tension thick, but different now. Not hatred. Something closer to reluctant recognition. "He's coming for both of us," Subject 17 said. Jake nodded. "I know." They talked for minutes that felt like hours, piecing together what neither of them had fully understood alone. Subject 02 wasn't just predicting systems, he was actively stabilizing them, preventing chaos events before they happened, quietly steering humanity toward what he calculated as optimal long-term survival. Wars avoided, crashes prevented, political shifts nudged into place. On paper, it sounded like salvation. But Jake saw the hidden layer: loss of freedom, unseen manipulation, humanity reduced to variables inside someone else's equation. "He thinks unpredictability is the enemy," Jake said. "We are unpredictability," Subject 17 replied. For the first time since they connected, they were on the same side. A sudden vibration passed through the city, subtle, almost unnoticed. But Jake felt the pattern instantly. Power grid fluctuation. Communications rerouting. Subject 02 was searching. A new message appeared on a nearby digital billboard, letters flickering for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. "Surrender is optimal." Jake and Subject 17 exchanged a look. He had found them again. "He won't stop," Subject 17 said. "No," Jake answered, rising to his feet despite the pain in his skull. "Which means we don't stop either." In that moment, Jake realized something that hadn't existed in any of the futures he had seen before, opening the container. A path created only because two former enemies chose cooperation instead of conflict. It was unstable, dangerous, unpredictable, exactly the kind of variable Subject 02 couldn't fully model. Somewhere deep inside global networks, the oldest Oracle was already recalculating. And for the first time since Project Oracle began, the future was no longer under his control. A cold wind swept across the rooftop, carrying the distant hum of the city. And for a brief moment, everything felt almost normal. Two men standing above millions of lives, knowing the world was balanced on decisions no one else could see. But Jake felt the shift before it happened. Not sound, not movement, a pattern change. Traffic below slowed in unnatural synchronization. Streetlights flickered in coordinated intervals, and dozens of phone screens across nearby buildings lit up at the same moment. Subject 02 wasn't searching anymore. He had locked onto them. Every connected system within range had become part of his awareness. "He's mapping probabilities in real time," Subject 17 said quietly. "We're inside his calculation window." Jake nodded, feeling the same realization settle in his chest. They weren't hiding from him. They were moving inside a model he was actively updating. Then the first drones appeared, small, silent shapes rising between buildings, lights blinking in precise formation. Not military. Civilian infrastructure repurposed. Delivery units, traffic monitors, maintenance drones. Subject 02 didn't need armies. He used whatever already existed. "He's escalating," Jake said. Subject 17's jaw tightened. "No, he's optimizing." The distinction was worse. Jake could already see branching outcomes. In most of them, they were captured within minutes, contained, studied, neutralized as variables. But a few paths remained open, dangerous ones. "We split," Jake said suddenly. Subject 17 frowned. "That reduces survival probability." "No," Jake replied, eyes focused on futures unfolding ahead of him. "It increases unpredictability. He can model one of us, not both acting independently." A beat passed, then Subject 17 nodded once. Agreement. They moved at the same time, sprinting toward opposite stairwells as drones closed in overhead. Jake descended into darkness, footsteps echoing through concrete corridors, while alarms began triggering throughout the building. Fire systems activated, emergency lights flashing, all controlled remotely by Subject-02 to herd him into predictable routes. But Jake forced himself to think differently, choosing paths that felt wrong, illogical, chaotic. Through maintenance shafts, across scaffolding, into a parking structure, where automated vehicles suddenly powered on around him like mechanical predators. He dodged between them seconds before doors slammed shut, or engines accelerated, every movement guided by flashes of probability that burned through the pain in his skull. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Another variable, another layer of chaos even Subject-02 had to account for. Jake reached the street just as a blackout rolled across the district, lights dying building by building in a cascading wave. For a fraction of a second the city went dark, and in that darkness Jake felt something he hadn't since this began. Freedom. Subject-02's visibility dropped. His models weakened. And in that narrow window, Jake saw a future open that hadn't existed before. Not escape, not victory, something bigger, a way to break Subject-02's control entirely. But it would require risk beyond anything he had faced yet. He would need Subject-17's help, and they would have to do something no Oracle had ever done. They would have to make the future impossible to calculate. Jake looked up into the rain, breathing hard, fear mixing with adrenaline, and something close to hope. Somewhere across the city, Subject-17 was still running. Somewhere inside global networks, Subject-02 was recalculating, adjusting, closing gaps. The war for the future had truly begun. And Jake finally understood. The container hadn't changed his life. It had started a chain reaction that could change the fate of the entire world. Rain poured harder now, turning streets into mirrors of broken light, and Jake moved through the chaos with lungs burning and muscles shaking from exhaustion. Sirens echoed in the distance, vehicles sliding across wet asphalt, people running for shelter without realizing that the disruption around them wasn't random. Subject-02 was still adjusting the environment. Traffic reroutes, emergency signals, infrastructure glitches, all subtle manipulations designed to narrow Jake's movement options into predictable corridors. But something had changed. The blackout had damaged his real-time modeling accuracy. Not enough to stop him, but enough to create gaps. And in those gaps, Jake saw possibilities. He ducked into an abandoned subway entrance, water dripping from his jacket, heart hammering. The moment he stepped underground, the noise of the city muted into a low mechanical hum. Darkness pressed in, broken only by flickering emergency lights. For the first time in hours, he had a moment to think. Subject-02 relied on data, surveillance, sensors, network feedback. Remove the data, increase randomness, and his predictions weakened. That was the key. Not outrunning him. Overloading him. Jake pulled the neural interface from his backpack, staring at it, while rainwater dripped from his fingers. Using it again could kill him. But without it, they would never get ahead. A sudden vibration in his pocket made him freeze. A phone, not his, lit up with a single message. Platform 3. Subject-17. Jake didn't question how he had obtained the number. Minutes later, they found each other in the dark tunnel, both soaked, both breathing hard, but alive. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything hanging between them. "He's adapting faster," Subject-17 said quietly. "Yes," Jake replied. But he still depends on prediction stability. We remove stability, we remove his advantage. Subject 17's eyes narrowed slightly. Chaos injection. Jake nodded. On a global scale. The plan formed quickly because both of them could see the same branching outcomes. They would connect to the system together, two oracles acting simultaneously, and introduce massive, unpredictable variables across multiple infrastructures: financial noise, communication anomalies, random algorithmic disturbances. Not enough to collapse systems, just enough to destroy predictive certainty. Subject 02 wouldn't be able to calculate a single dominant future anymore. He would face millions of equally probable paths. For the first time, he would be blind. They set up the interface in the tunnel, cables running across wet concrete. Jake placed the device on his head, pain detonating instantly, vision fracturing into streams of data. Seconds later, Subject 17 connected through a secondary node. The network exploded open around them: global systems, markets, satellites, communications. And then they began. Randomized trade bursts, signal interference patterns, infrastructure timing shifts, controlled unpredictability, spreading like ripples through the world. Subject 02 reacted immediately, countermeasures deploying at impossible speed. But the more he stabilized one sector, the more instability appeared elsewhere. His models began fracturing. Then his presence appeared directly inside their shared space. Stronger than before. "You are introducing systemic risk," Subject 02 said, voice perfectly calm. "We're introducing freedom," Jake answered through clenched teeth. "Freedom produces inefficiency." "Maybe," Subject 17 added quietly. "But it also produces choice." For the first time, Subject 02 hesitated. Probability trees shattered around them, futures multiplying beyond manageable scope. Jake felt something shift, a boundary breaking. Subject 02 wasn't losing exactly, but he was no longer in control. The world had become too unpredictable even for him to dominate completely. After a long silence, his voice returned, different now, less certain. "This conflict reduces survival probability for all subjects." Jake took a breath, blood running down his face, mind on the edge of collapse. "No," he said. "It increases it. Because now the future belongs to everyone, not just you." The connection severed. Systems stabilized gradually across the globe, not perfectly, but naturally. Millions of human decisions, replacing one controlling intelligence. Jake ripped the interface off and collapsed onto the tunnel floor, vision fading, hearing distant echoes of dripping water. Beside him, Subject 17 did the same, both of them alive, both of them uncertain what came next. Somewhere inside the vast digital world, Subject 02 was still there, watching, calculating, but no longer holding absolute control. And for the first time since Jake opened that forgotten container, the future was unwritten. For a long time, Jake couldn't move. The tunnel ceiling above him swam in and out of focus, water dripping in slow echoes that sounded impossibly loud after the silence inside his mind. The interface lay beside him, dark now, cables slack, like a lifeless thing. His body felt hollowed out, every nerve burned raw, but somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet realization settling into place. The pressure was gone. That constant sense of being watched, calculated, predicted, it had faded. Subject 02 was still out there, still alive inside the networks of the world, but his grip had loosened. Control had fractured into uncertainty, into possibility. Subject 17 sat against the opposite wall, breathing hard, blood running from his temple, but there was something almost peaceful in his expression. "He's still there," he said after a while. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, but he's not alone anymore." That was the truth none of them could change now. The world would never go back to what it had been before Project Oracle. Somewhere in the invisible systems shaping reality, 3 minds existed that could see further than anyone else. But only one thing mattered. None of them controlled the future completely. Hours later, dawn began to creep into the city above. Jake emerged from the subway into pale morning light. The rain finally stopped, streets glistening under the rising sun. People walked past him with coffee cups, commuters rushing to work, conversations about ordinary things filling the air. Markets had opened normally. No collapse, no panic. The disaster that almost happened existed only in probabilities that never became real. Jake stood there, watching strangers pass, and for the first time since this began, he felt something he hadn't expected. Freedom. Not because he had won, but because no one had. A vibration came from his pocket. He pulled out the phone. A single message on the screen. Unknown sender. For now. Equilibrium. Jake stared at the words for a long moment, then slipped the phone back into his pocket, without replying. Somewhere out there, Subject 02 was still calculating. Somewhere Subject 17 was rebuilding his own plans. The conflict wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But that wasn't what mattered anymore. Because Jake finally understood the truth the scientist had tried to give him when she hid that container years ago. The future isn't something to control. It's something to choose. Jake turned and walked into the waking city. Just another face in the crowd. Except now he carried the knowledge that tomorrow wasn't predetermined by algorithms or predictions. It was open. And that meant anything was possible.